So do you all know that feeling when you get home at the end of a really hard day and all you want to do is sit on the couch, put up your feet, and complain to anyone who might listen, even if it is just your cat? Do you know that feeling? Please tell me I'm not alone. And now let's say you end up doing just that. How many of you find that yourself apologizing by the end? I'm sorry I'm so cranky, you say. Or, sorry I'm such a downer tonight. I see this happen sometimes during the check-ins that we routinely do at the beginning of our meetings here as well. When we actually take that time to share something hard in our lives. And then, instead of breathing through it together, we giggle nervously or apologize. It's as if we experience such discomfort with our own hard feelings that we feel guilty for daring to share them with others. It's as if we feel like we have to apologize for not being happy all the time, for experiencing some difficulty or pain in our lives. This challenge with hard feelings, with grief, pain, anger, seems to often almost be an intrinsic part of our American culture, and perhaps even more specifically here, our New England culture. We are stoic and hardworking. There is always someone worse off, after all, and we wouldn't want to ruin a perfectly good conversation with the mention of any of those discomforting topics. We struggle. We struggle to face our own hard feelings. We struggle with expressing our pain, our sorrow, our anger. And we struggle with hearing the pain and sorrow of others. It's that same part of our culture that means that we give folks 3 bereavement days when the loved one dies, and then expect the bereaved one to come back to the regular world and be fully functional right away. It's the part of our culture that wonders why people need to fill the streets to mourn and rage together when yet another unarmed black person is murdered by the police. It's the part of our culture that asks, "Are you feeling better yet?" with emphasis on the yet. We've failed as a culture to teach people 2 important skills. First, we've failed to teach people how to sit with and work through their own hard emotions, grief, anger, pain, and more. And second, we have failed to teach people how to be in the presence of the hard emotions of others, how to sit with one another in our pain. So instead of being present with and working through these emotions, we ignore and repress. We move too quickly to the light. We move too quickly to find that silver lining. We diminish our own feelings and experiences, and we diminish the feelings and experiences of others. We diminish the failures and tragedies of our world. Daniel Migliori and Kathleen Billman have a book called Rachel's Cry, which is all about the ritual, the prayer of lament. And they say, "We are a people reluctant to grieve our failures, especially our corporate and public failures, limitations, and losses. In the face of lamentable realities, whether the bombing of Hiroshima or the continuing racism of our society, we are adept at psychic numbing and theological cover-up. In our Unitarian Universalist circles, our theological cover-up tends to revolve around the notion of progress onward and upward forever. We believe we ought to be constantly working to improve the self, to improve our world, and that those negative emotions hold us back. We might say lament distracts us from the work at hand. And it shows weakness, right? A weakness that we don't have any time for. We're busy fixing the world, after all. Migliore and Billman would argue, however, that lament does just the opposite. It's not a sign of weakness, but a sign of taking control. Rather than distracting, lament gives us space and time we need to feel sorrow, pain, anger, all those negative emotions we avoid, so that we might move more fully into healing and hope. In fact, they would say that lament itself is an essential part of claiming agency in our own healing and in our world. Now, lament is a centuries-old practice. It is nothing new. A centuries-old practice by people of faith and people of no faith. A passionate expression of grief or sorrow. It's sometimes associated with public wailing or the rending of garments, but can also be quiet and soulful, a solitary mourning. We find it in ancient Greek writings, in the Jewish and Christian scriptures, and in historical accounts of many ages. The most famous biblical laments are found in the prayers of lament that are found in the book of Psalms. Often the psalmist will ask, how long? How long until this time of suffering is over? How long must we be slaves or captives? How long until we feel God's presence once again? Sometimes these laments are personal. A lament for a lost family member or friend, for example. But more often they're societal, lamenting the current state of affairs, the current sins and oppressions of one's people. Billman and Migliore are not the only ones who contend that lament is a lost art that needs to be recovered. Many theologians and pastoral caregivers would agree. In this culture of covering up and avoiding our negative emotions, we need to do more to intentionally make space for lament. A beautiful story of someone doing just that comes from Otsuchi, Japan. Otsuchi was one of the towns that was absolutely devastated by the tsunami back in 2011. It was a tsunami that killed 19,000 people and left thousands missing. 421 went missing in Otsuchi alone, not a large town to begin with. Everyone was affected. A man named Itaro, who lived in Otsuchi, had been struggling with grief before the tsunami came. His cousin had died just a year earlier, and he was having a hard time figuring out how to talk about it, how to deal with his grief. And after the tsunami came, it was just too much. And so he did something entirely unexpected. He got an old-fashioned phone booth, one of those rectangular English style, painted white with square glass panes. He got one of those phone booths and he put it in his yard. Inside there was a little wooden shelf upon which sat an old black rotary phone, not connected to any phone line. Itaro would come out to the phone booth often, pick up that phone, and speak to his dead cousin. He would tell his cousin about what was happening in his life, about how much he missed him, about how hard it was to live on after the tsunami. That phone booth became a place of refuge for Itaru, a place of solace where he could air out his grief. Itaro called it the wind telephone because he knew his thoughts and words could not be relayed over a telephone line, and hoped that they would be carried on the wind instead. The word spread about this wind telephone, and others from Otsuchi began to stop by to use it as well. They would take a turn in that phone booth talking to their missing or dead loved ones. Soon, people are coming from all over Japan to use the wind telephone. And by now, thousands of people have taken comfort in this space set aside to work through their grief. There's a documentary that's been made about the phone that shares some of the poignant and heartfelt conversations. For many, this has become a place where they can finally speak aloud their complicated feelings after the tsunami. In the documentary, one family comes in and takes turns talking to their missing dad on the phone. Afterwards, we find out that it is the first time they have talked about their dad at all since he went missing. One of them shares that it seemed something shifted that day for them, for the better. By creating the wind telephone, Itaro created a space for grief, anger, fear, and more to be poured out uninhibited. He created an actual physical container for working through these hard feelings, making a space to feel whatever it was you were going to feel without guilt or shame about those feelings. He made a space for modern-day lament. I experienced another example of modern-day lament a few years ago at a very unique Kol Nidre service. As Dan mentioned, we're in the midst of the High Holy Days, and Kol Nidre is a Jewish service that happens on the evening before Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And it typically includes some sort of naming and letting go of transgressions from the past year, something like that reading that Dan led us in earlier. The idea is that you want to start the year with a clean slate, and speaking those transgressions aloud gives you the ability to let go of them. Now, the Kol Nidre service that I attended took place at the Occupy encampment in Boston back in 2011. The encampment was part of the larger Occupy Wall Street movement that was protesting economic injustice and the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. After some words and singing, everyone present was invited to name aloud not their personal sins in this case, but instead the sins of society, the economic inequality, racism, violence, and more that the Occupy movement was fighting against. Those sins that all of us are a part of. Now, I don't actually remember what the liturgy exactly looked like, but it was a powerful experience. The emotional experience for me stuck. It was a listening, witnessing, naming our complicity in these societal sins. In that moment, we made space for our laments for the world, and we acknowledged our part in making the world so. I still remember the emotions of the service. It was a service that I needed in that moment, a time and space to acknowledge the depth of pain in the world and recommit to making the world a better place. As theologian Walter Brueggemann points out, laments are all an expression of grief, but they are also an expression of hope. They are an insistence that things cannot remain as they are, and they must be changed. They are also a communal resolve to hang in and take transformative action. Brueggemann claims that lament has nothing at all to do with self-pity or wallowing. Instead, it is a necessary and intentional action towards healing. This is the kind of lament that I hope we can reclaim as Unitarian Universalists. Most of us don't rend our garments in grief anymore, but we do need spaces where we can cry out in sorrow, anger, pain. We need containers, whether physical or spiritual, to hold these emotions and offer us the time and space to work through them. We need to be able to name and claim our grief and pain. We need to be able to name and claim the injustice and oppression in our world. We need to be able to cry out so that we might transform our grief into energy and capacity for healing. We need to lament so that we might be able to begin to find our way to hope. So I wonder, how can you make a little more space for lament in your life? Now, I hope it's a little spiritually deeper than just end of the hard day complaining on the couch, but sometimes that's what you need, right? So the next time you feel pain or sorrow or anger, I want you to pause and take a breath. What do you need in that moment to make space for that emotion and to work through it? What do you need to be able to speak that feeling aloud without apologizing for it? How can you hear the hard feelings of others without shutting down in despair yourself or minimizing their pain? Maybe you need to cry out, "How long? How long?" Maybe you need to let yourself have a good cry. Maybe you just need to shout a little bit out in the middle of the woods. Whatever lament looks like for you, give that a little more space than you may be comfortable with. Try sitting, being with those emotions. With any luck and a little determination, it will serve as a catalyst for healing, a catalyst for action. So in that spirit, I want to invite you now into a time of contemplation. The choir is going to sing for us a beautiful song of lament. And I want you, as they sing, to consider, what is your lament right now? What do you need to make space and time to grieve or rage about? Hold that now in your heart as the choir sings, "How long?"